This did not unfold quietly. Prince William drew a line. Prince Harry crossed it, and Meghan Markle stood at the center of consequences still spreading. What followed was not a scandal, but recalculation of power, loyalty, and legacy inside a family that never forgets. Within hours of the decision, the consequences were already visible. Calls stopped returning. Schedules quietly changed. Invitations that once arrived as a formality were suddenly absent. Reports claim Prince William believed the moment demanded finality, not negotiation, after years of strain that had become publicly unmanageable. Prince Harry, according to sources familiar with the situation, learned of the shift indirectly, not through conversation, but through absence. Security protocols altered. Doors that had remained symbolically open were no longer so. It's been said this was intentional, a signal rather than an announcement, designed to end ambiguity without provoking immediate public confrontation. The conflict did not emerge overnight. For years, tensions had moved beneath the surface, shaped by disagreements over role, responsibility, and exposure. Prince William is said to have grown increasingly concerned about institutional stability, particularly as personal grievances began intersecting with public narratives. The monarchy survives on continuity, and any uncertainty around loyalty is viewed as a structural risk. Meghan Markle's presence in this dynamic has been widely discussed, often irresponsibly. What can be said cautiously is that her role accelerated conversations already underway. Sources suggest disagreements about boundaries, privacy, and media strategy hardened positions on both sides. None of this confirms blame. It confirms fracture. Financial and symbolic power sit at the heart of this rupture. Titles matter, but access matters more. Residences, security arrangements, and proximity to ceremonial life define relevance within the royal system. When those begin to shift, the message is unmistakable. Reports suggest this recalibration was framed internally as protection, not punishment, aimed at shielding future heirs from ongoing turbulence. The timing is critical. With long-term planning underway and fewer senior figures carrying public duties, decision-making has narrowed. That concentration of responsibility changes how disputes are handled. Conversations once mediated by tradition now move through private offices, legal counsel, and strategic advisors. Silence becomes policy. Prince Harry's position, according to accounts, is one of disbelief rather than shock. There had been warnings. There had been pauses. But permanence alters perception. It transforms disagreement into loss. Friends reportedly describe a man caught between defiance and grief, aware that every response risks reinforcing the very conclusions being drawn about him. Public reaction, while loud, remains secondary inside palace walls. What matters there is precedent. Once boundaries are enforced, reversing them becomes difficult without appearing weak. That calculus favors endurance over reconciliation. It is also why sources say this moment was chosen carefully, when sympathy could be absorbed and institutional priorities clearly stated. Careful language has been used throughout. Officials avoid absolutes. Reports claim terms like ban or exile are resisted internally, replaced by procedural phrasing that limits challenge. This ambiguity serves a purpose. It slows backlash, buys time, and keeps leverage intact while public attention focuses elsewhere, allowing decisions to settle before they are fully understood. None of this confirms an irreversible outcome. Royal history allows for distance without total erasure, but the mechanisms that once enabled quiet repair appear dormant. What remains is a narrowing corridor, where each step forward reduces a space to turn back, and where the next move will determine whether separation hardens into something permanent. What complicates this moment is not emotion, but leverage. Long before reputations were questioned, financial lines had already been redrawn, quietly and deliberately. Sources suggest this was the first pressure point, applied without spectacle. Because money inside the monarchy is never just money, it is authority made operational. Prince Harry's financial independence, often described publicly as freedom, has been viewed internally as separation. Funding streams once tied to duty were replaced with private arrangements, contracts, and external partnerships. That shift altered expectations. When accountability no longer runs through the institution, influence weakens. Reports claim this imbalance became a recurring concern, especially as private ventures began intersecting with royal identity. Prince William's position is shaped by this reality. Control of resources, estates, and allocations is not merely administrative. It defines who belongs within the system's inner ring. According to those familiar with internal discussions, the concern was not income itself, but unpredictability. Financial autonomy limits the monarchy's ability to contain fallout when narratives spiral beyond its reach. Reputational strain followed naturally. Public disclosures, interviews, and memoir excerpts reframe private disputes as moral conflicts. It's been said palace officials felt boxed in, unable to rebut claims without escalating visibility. Silence, once a shield, began to look like concession. Every unanswered allegation lingered, shaping perception by default. Meghan Markle's influence in this phase is described cautiously by sources, not as a driver, but as a catalyst. Her comfort with media engagement contrasted sharply with royal convention. That contrast sharpened fault lines already present. What mattered internally was not intention, but effect. The monarchy measures outcomes, not motives. As reputational risk grew, institutional responses hardened. Advisors reportedly warned that unresolved disputes could undermine future authority, especially with younger heirs approaching greater visibility. Stability, in this view, required containment. Limiting proximity became a preventative measure, not an emotional reaction. This is where the shift becomes structural. Invitations, access, and ceremonial inclusion are not gestures of goodwill. They are signals of trust. When those signals dim, the message travels quickly through diplomatic channels, security teams, and international partners. Reports suggest this recalibration was noticed well beyond palace grounds. Prince Harry's attempt to challenge these changes have been described as reactive rather than strategic. Appeals, statements, and legal efforts kept the story alive, but did little to restore standing. Each move, sources say, reinforced concerns about volatility. In institutions built on predictability, persistence can be misread as defiance. Meanwhile, Prince William's approach has been notably restrained. No public declarations, no visible triumph, just alignment, advisors, legal counsel, and senior figures moving in quiet agreement that unanimity matters. It signals that this is not a personal feud being indulged, but a direction being set. Legacy now enters the frame. Decisions made at this level ripple forward, shaping what future generations inherit. The monarchy's strength lies in continuity, not reconciliation. Once a line is drawn, erasing it requires more than goodwill. It requires consensus, timing, and a compelling reason to risk reversal. What remains uncertain is whether such a reason still exists. With each passing month, distance normalizes, absence becomes routine, and what once felt unthinkable begins to look permanent. Not because it was declared so, but because no one moved to stop it. There's a moment in every long conflict when silence stops being neutral. It begins to speak on its own, carrying meaning no statement could safely deliver. According to sources, that moment arrived when institutional routines adjusted without explanation, as if the system itself had already decided how this story would be told. Behind closed doors, the conversation shifted away from personalities and toward governance. Advisors reportedly reframed the situation not as a family dispute, but as an operational risk. Institutions do this when emotions become unpredictable. They replace dialogue with procedure. What follows feels cold, but it is deliberate. Prince William's role in this phase is described as procedural rather than personal. Meetings became shorter. Decisions were documented more carefully. Communications narrowed to essential channels only. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Whatever sympathy remained, it would not override structure. That is how institutions protect themselves when reconciliation becomes uncertain. Prince Harry, meanwhile, found himself facing a system that no longer responds to appeals in the way families do. Reports suggest that even well-intentioned outreach was interpreted through a legal and strategic lens. Every message was assessed for implication, not emotion. That shift alone changes everything. Once human interaction becomes institutional record, vulnerability becomes liability. The reputational dimension intensified this dynamic. Public narratives continue to circulate, often driven by commentary rather than confirmation. Palace officials, according to accounts, worried less about accuracy than accumulation. When claims stack, They create a fog that is difficult to clear. The institution's instinct in such conditions is withdrawal, not engagement. What makes this especially complex is that the monarchy cannot simply disengage from its own members without consequence. Each distancing measure sets precedent. Who is included? Who is consulted? Who is visible? These decisions are watched closely, not just by the public, but by governments, charities, and foreign counterparts. Consistency signals stability. Inconsistency invites doubt. Meghan Markle's name continued to surface in discussions, though rarely as a focal point. Sources suggest her presence functioned more as a variable than a cause. The concern was not influence, but unpredictability. Institutions struggle with narratives they cannot shape. Any external platform amplifies that challenge. As this recalibration unfolded, the language used internally became increasingly formal. Terms like reconciliation and healing reportedly gave way to containment and future planning. That linguistic shift matters. It reveals intention. When vocabulary changes, strategy follows. Legacy concerns then move to the forefront. This is where the conflict transcends the present and begins to shape the future. Advisors are said to have raised questions about what younger generations would inherit, not emotionally, but structurally, which relationships are normalized, which absences become expected. Children learn what they see repeated. Prince William's thinking, as described by those close to him, centers on endurance. He is said to believe that the monarchy survives not by resolving every fracture, but by outlasting turbulence. That philosophy values restraint over repair. It also accepts loss as a cost of continuity. Prince Harry's position becomes more precarious in this context. Without institutional backing, his voice exists largely outside the framework that once amplified it. Efforts to assert relevance risk reinforcing the very narrative being used to justify distance. It is a narrowing corridor where each step forward feels like resistance rather than reconciliation. Observers note that no formal declaration has been made, and that absence is intentional. Declarations invite debate. Silence allows decisions to settle. Over time, what was once controversial becomes routine. This is how institutional memory is shaped, not by announcements, but by repetition. The emotional toll is real, but it is no longer central to decision-making. Institutions acknowledge grief without allowing to dictate outcomes. That distinction feels harsh, yet explains why empathy and access do not always move in tandem. What remains unresolved is whether legacy can be preserved without connection. History offers examples in both directions. Some rifts soften with time, others calcify into narrative. The determining factor is rarely intention, it is timing. As months pass and routine stabilize, the cost of change rises. Reversing course becomes disruptive rather than healing. And so the most powerful force at work may not be anger or pride, but momentum, quiet, procedural, and increasingly difficult to stop. What few outside observers recognize is how quickly the conflict moved from management to memory. Once procedures settle, they begin shaping how events are remembered, not just how they are handled. Sources suggest this is where the situation now sits, no longer in dispute, but in record. Institutional memory is selective. It does not preserve emotion. It preserves outcomes. Internal briefings reportedly began referencing the situation as a resolved adjustment rather than an active issue. That language matters. When something is no longer framed as ongoing, it stops attracting resources. Attention shifts elsewhere. Prince William's influence in this phase is described as steady, not forceful. He is said to rely on alignment rather than command. Senior figures understand the implications without being told. No one wants to reopen a matter already classified as settled. Doing so invites instability, and stability is the currency of the institution. Prince Harry's visibility, by contrast, has become more symbolic than functional. Without access to the rhythms of royal life, his presence exists largely in contrast to it. Each appearance, each statement, is measured against absence. That comparison rarely favors the one outside. Reports claim this imbalance has affected how external partners respond. Charities, governments, and organizations prefer clarity. When affiliation becomes ambiguous, engagement cools. This is not punishment. It is risk management. Institutions gravitate towards certainty, even when it feels impersonal. Meghan Markle's role continues to be discussed, but increasingly as part of a broader narrative about independence versus integration. Sources suggest concern was never about individual actions, but about parallel structures. When narratives operate outside official channels, control becomes diluted. For a monarchy built on coherence, that dilution is destabilizing. Legacy concerns deepen here. The monarchy is not only managing the present, but teaching the future. Younger generations observe what is tolerated and what is excluded. Patterns become lessons. Absence becomes normal. Repetition turns decisions into tradition. Prince William's long-term view reportedly prioritizes this transmission. He is said to believe that clarity now prevents confusion later. That philosophy accepts discomfort in exchange for durability. It also assumes that time favors the institution, not the individual. Prince Harry's emotional landscape, as described by those close to him, has shifted from protest to reckoning. There is recognition. Sources say that pathways once available have narrowed. Efforts to reframe the situation risk reinforcing perceptions of unpredictability. Silence, however painful, may feel safer than misinterpretation. This creates a paradox. The less engagement there is, the harder it becomes to restore it. Distance reduces friction, but also erodes familiarity. Over time, relationships are not broken by conflict, but by lack of reference. People forget how to speak to one another. Observers note that no intermediary has emerged with the authority to bridge this gap. Figures who might once have played that role are either absent or unwilling. Without a trusted conduit, messages stall. Intentions remain untested. The public narrative continues, but it now trails the institutional one. Commentary reacts to developments that have already been absorbed internally. By the time speculation surfaces, decisions have often been operational for months. This lag creates frustration, but it also shields the institution from reactive pressure. What remains unresolved is not whether reconciliation is possible, but whether it is useful. Institutions do not pursue harmony for its own sake. They pursue function. If function has been restored without repair, incentive diminishes. History offers examples where time softened divisions. It also offers examples where silence solidified them. The difference often lies in whether absence becomes identity. Once someone is known primarily for not being there, return requires reframing, not apology. As routines continue and new priorities emerge, the cost of revisiting old fractures increases. Each year adds layers of procedure, precedent, and expectation. Undoing them requires more than goodwill. It requires justification strong enough to disrupt stability. For now, momentum favors continuation. Quiet decisions, once made, rarely announce themselves again. They simply persist, shaping outcomes without revisiting origins. And in that persistence lies the unresolved tension, not dramatic, not loud, but steadily narrowing the space where reversal might still occur. There is a point where distance stops being measured in time and starts being measured in consequence. That point appears to be approaching now, not because of a new decision, but because of what has not happened. No outreach, no recalibration, no signal that the trajectory is changing. Sources suggest the institution has moved into forward posture. Planning documents, long-range schedules, and advisory briefings now assume continuity without disruption. This is how permanence is built, not through declarations, but through assumption. When plans no longer account for return becomes unlikely. Prince William's position in this final phase is shaped less by choice than by inheritance. He is preparing for a role that tolerates little ambiguity. Stability is not a preference at that level. It is a requirement. Advisors are said to view unresolved personal dynamics as vulnerabilities, especially in an era where scrutiny is constant and patience is thin. Prince Harry's options narrow further within this framework. Without institutional leverage, influence becomes symbolic. Symbolic influence can move public sentiment, but it rarely moves structure. Reports claim there is growing awareness that emotional appeal and operational authority are not interchangeable. One speaks loudly, the other decides quietly. Meghan Markle's presence remains a point of commentary, but increasingly it feels peripheral to the outcome. The system is no longer reacting to personalities. It is reacting to precedent. Once a pattern is set, individuals matter less than what they represent. In this case, Separation has become the pattern. Legacy now stands at the center. Not legacy as memory, but legacy as architecture. What is being built will outlast current figures. Future generations will inherit not just titles, but norms. They will learn who is consulted, who is included, and who exists outside the frame. There is an unspoken cost to this clarity. Institutions that endure often do so by absorbing loss. They trade warmth for reliability. Over time, this shapes how they are perceived, not just by the public, but by those within them. Belonging becomes conditional. Loyalty becomes procedural. Prince Harry's emotional reality, according to those close to him, is settling into something quieter, less confrontation, more reflection, the realization that some doors close without sound, that not every ending arrives with a moment of recognition. Some simply fade into routine. The absence of final rupture makes this harder to process. There is no singular event to point to, no scene of collapse, just a series of adjustments that, taken together, redraw the map. This is why the situation feels unresolved to outsiders. Even as it feels concluded internally, observers continue to ask whether time might soften the divide. Time can do many things. It can dull anger. It can create nostalgia. But it can also normalize absence. Once absence feels ordinary, presence feels intrusive. That is the risk now taking shape. What remains is a legacy suspended between intention and outcome. A family history marked by closeness, now reframed by distance. An institution that values continuity, now carrying the weight of what continuity required it to relinquish. There is no clear villain here, no singular betrayal, only competing priorities that could not coexist indefinitely. Protection versus expression, stability versus openness, endurance versus repair. As the institution moves forward, it does so with quiet confidence. The machinery continues. Ceremonies proceed. Plans advance. The story does not pause for resolution. It rarely does. And somewhere within that forward motion lies the unanswered question, not whether reconciliation could happen, but whether the moment for it is already past.